Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Welcome back, Curtinistas, men and women of Australia. That's originally a John Curtin line from his December 1941 speech announcing that the nation was at war with Japan, which Gough later borrowed very eloquently during the 1972 election campaign, during the election campaign launch speech. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast. Today on the theme of Gough and everything Whitlamite and the dismissal, which occurs 50 years ago from today. We're joined by Troy Bramston, senior writer and columnist at The Australian and one of the country's most prolific political biographers. You all know his books on Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Robert Menzies, many more, and now he's gone back to the great trauma story of modern Labor. His new book, Gough Whitlam, The Vista of the New, is a 700-plus page cradle-to-the-grave biography built on new interviews with the Whitlam family, Malcolm Fraser, the Palace and Government House sources, and a huge swag of archival material, all timed for the 50th anniversary of the dismissal. Today, we're going to talk about the man, the certain grandeur, the myth, the madness of 1975, and what Gough still means to Labor in 2025. And I'm delighted that we're also being joined by Emma Dawson, Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. Emma's back, glutton for punishment as Cosmos Kung Fu Samaras is away, globetrotting through somewhere. I won't give his location away. Emma, welcome to Curtin's Cast. It's great to have you back. Troy Bramston, welcome to the pod.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's good to be back. I was here a few years ago talking about Bob Hawke, and now we're back talking about another Labor legend. So thanks for having me. It's
wonderful to have you back, mate, because I know you're really busy. There's a nostalgia fiesta going on, and you're at the heart of it. I believe there's a lot of activities today and a conference tomorrow. So we're really pleased that you're able to take time out. We were talking before we jumped on that you described that you felt the tremors in the womb of the dismissal because you were born in December 1975. So we now know how old you are. You've got a big birthday coming up this year, Troy. And you've been studying Gough, you've been studying Labor history for decades, and you've said that this is a fresh take on Whitlam. Half a century on, can I ask you, what is new?
Well, Nick, I mean, there's a lot that's new, really. I mean, right from the get-go, I discovered that Gough Whitlam's name, let's start there. I mean, his name is Edward Gough Whitlam, and it had often been suspected that he went by the middle name Gough because he has a maternal grandfather, Edward Maddox. But in actual fact, his family told me the real story, which is that his mother had found some boys in Melbourne one day. This is, around about 1917, 1918. And they were teasing another boy because his name was Edward. And they were shortening it to Ned and likening him to Ned Kelly. Ah. So the last thing Gough's mother wanted was for her son to be any way likened to that notorious Melbourne bushranger. So there you have it. So right from the very beginning, I'm busting the myths out of the gate. And I think another one was that he was not baptised. So Gough had a real fascination with religion and his parents were Baptists, but I discovered that he wasn't baptised. I went looking for the baptism certificate and couldn't find it. And so his son, Tony Whitlam, said, "You've discovered the family secret." He was confirmed in the Anglican Church, but not baptised. So there you go. So there's still things to find out about our Prime Ministers.
Why?
Well, Baptists are baptised at adolescence. And by the time he was an adolescent, he was at Canberra Grammar. Okay. So he was a teenager. So he sort of missed the time when Baptists typically get baptised, like Catholics would get baptised at birth, but that wasn't Gough. So he kind of missed out. And he had this fascination with religion. He loved religion. He used to study different Bibles in church, and he studied the hymn book. And, there's a great story that when he was in a Canberra high school that he came first in divinity, but he was denied the school prize because the headmaster said he didn't believe it. So that's a good requirement for getting the divinity prize. So he was actually an atheist by the time he was a teenager.
That's great. I want to stick with his childhood. I would have thought there would have been a Baptist church somewhere in Canberra, but I guess Canberra's a bit different to the rest of Oz. Subtitle of your book is The Vista of the New. And you found an early poem where Gough talks about young people craving, quote, the vista of the new. What do you think that tells us about the later Gough? Gough, the MP, Gough, Prime Minister, the years 1972, 75. Was he basically enacting a vision that he'd had from childhood through university? And on the flip side, did that sort of almost futurist streak make him blind to constraint, which sort of played out, I guess, most dramatically in the events of 1975?
Yeah, it's interesting, Nick. You always look for a great subtitle for these books or a title. And, there's Crash or Crash Through, there's Well May We Say, there's Men and Women of Australia, there's all sorts of things. But I came across this poem that he wrote when he was a student at Canberra Grammar, 1934, and he loved poetry. He did a lot of poetry. He did Greek translations and all these kind of things. Anyway, he said in this poem in 1934 that we have the verdant vista of the new. And what he meant by that was he had respect for tradition and heritage, but he was dreaming of a bigger and brighter future. He's dreaming of the future for Australia. That's what he was imagining. And he wanted to play a big role in that. And he said the future, it belongs to the next generation. So I think, it's interesting. He's growing up in Canberra and he's seeing this new capital city come into being, rising from the red dirt. He's seeing what a national government can do. He's seeing a government play a role in urban planning. And so he's thinking about the future and he's thinking, I want to play a role in that. And so that poem seemed to sort of encapsulise for me the young Gough and his dream of one day playing some kind of role in Australia's future.
I think it's worth stressing a lot. Again, we're talking off air. A lot of people. There are now voters, Troy and Emma, who were 18 when Kevin Rudd won office. So for a lot of people, they don't have a hugely detailed knowledge of Gough beyond the mythology and the grandeur. He came from a background then, and he served during World War II, which wasn't typically Labor, was it? He was from middle class, some would say upper middle class background, although he later, the seat of Werriwa that he took up certainly represented suburban working class Australians.
Yeah, I would say that he's an upper middle class background, first in Melbourne, then in Sydney, and then the family moved to Canberra when the new capital comes into being, and his father becomes the Commonwealth Crown Solicitor. So they're mixing in elite circles. They're having politicians, they're having senior public servants to the House, and this is what it was for him. He's going to the local high school, Tilapia Park School, and then he goes to Canberra Grammar, which is, again, an elite school. So that's the circles that he's moving in. But his father has this great interest in international humanitarianism and has a sort of a fondness and a respect for Doc Evatt and his wartime contributions during the Curtin and Chifley governments. And so he's sort of schooled in that history as well and this sort of religious belief that, you look after your fellow human being. So it's very patrician. It's kind of an overused word, but it is patrician. And so this is a guy who loved, ancient Greece and Rome and wrote poems and loved the opera and things like that. But he decided to stand with the average, everyday working class men and women of Australia and identified with their concerns and their interests and what they thought they might want from a government. So, so it's really interesting that he does have that kind of sense of noblesse oblige is the term they use, and that's him.
Fascinating, really. I want to go back. You said, Troy, having made that discovery about the baptism or lack thereof, you spoke with all 4 Whitlam children for this new book. What did they tell you? Have you got any? I mean, I don't want to spoil the book. People should go out and read it, obviously. But anything juicier and new that they shared with you that might puncture the widely accepted myth of Gough?
Well, look, it was really interesting to talk to the 4 Whitlam children. They don't tend to do too many interviews. Nick and Tony, the older boys, had very public lives in business or politics, the law, but Catherine and Stephen did not. And they all in various ways suffered by being a Whitlam. Catherine changed her name. She went back to her mother's maiden name, Dovey, after Gough was Prime Minister. They all felt that they had been somewhat limited afterwards by being associated with their father, who they loved very much. So when I try to interview these family members about prime ministers, you learn a lot about what they're like behind closed doors. What are their hobbies? What are their interests? What do they eat? Do they exercise? What do they do for downtime? So I try to get a sense of that in the book. And, they're very proud of their father. They love him very much, but they're not blind to his faults. He could be aloof. He could be arrogant. He could be prone to temper tantrums. And they sort of experienced all of that. And it's great to talk to them about, particularly growing up in Cronulla. So I grew up in Cronulla, and this is where Gough lived from 1947 to 1957. It's where he first went into the National Parliament as the member for Werriwa. But, of course, he'd run twice for the Sutherland Shire Council and lost, once for the state seat of Sutherland and lost. So this is the area that really is his sort of like, where he learnt the art of politics. It's sort of the crucible for him. And so talking to them about what it was like growing up in those suburbs and then later on in Cabramatta, you do get a real insight into these personalities.
And the great Margaret Whitlam, I mean, Gough and Margaret were a team. I mean, she's often, I think these days, thought of as a political wife, as a little bit of witty background colour, perhaps. But does she become more central in your reading of Gough's life? I mean, to me, she was always, one of his greatest confidants and moral supporters. How does she come through in your book?
Yeah, Emma, look, it's actually really interesting to spend time, in this book about Margaret and talk about her life story. Her father was a Supreme Court judge in New South Wales. She was living in Vaucluse. She's very much upper class, connected Sydney. And they meet at university. They meet at a Sydney University Dramatic Society Christmas party. And, of course, he's 6'4", she's 6'3", so they immediately notice each other across the room. And they're sort of connected with each other. The romance kind of starts a bit slow. I looked at Margaret's diaries and things like that and correspondence, and she's still seeing other people and enjoying Sydney life in pre-war Sydney. But she does gravitate towards Gough and finds him interesting and attractive. And they get married in 1942, quite a lavish wedding, which was a bit odd for wartime Sydney. And, of course, then he quickly goes and serves abroad. But there was a great companionship there, a commonality of interests, but they're very different personalities. Margaret is a much more grounded person, much better judge of character, judge of people and situations. And as you say, when he's involved in politics and particularly when he becomes Labor leader, the party's research found that she was kind of like a secret weapon and that she should be brought more into the party's campaigning because she could soften some of his harder edges. And it was fascinating to understand that Margaret was, writing articles for Women's Day and appearing on TV shows like Beauty and the Beast, and she had very strong opinions. And so she's a sort of a public figure in her own right. She had a university degree. Of course, they'd met at university. So she was sort of a different kind of prime ministerial spouse, but she didn't force her beliefs or views onto Gough. She was very strict about that. She had her views and she would express them, but she didn't sort of press them on her husband.
Fascinating. There might be a book, I'm going to ask you at the end, Troy, what you're working on there. There might be a book on prime ministerial spouses. Well,
they're all very different.
They certainly are.
Yeah.
Coming back to, so, Gough, unconventional background for a politician of that era, middle class lawyer.
Well, let's just pause on that, Nick,
I'm
because
very happy to pause for you, Troy.
it is really unusual. I mean, he gets to the Parliament in 1952 and he's a young man in an old man's party, right? These are the sort of old grey men of the Labor Party.
And they don't like him.
They don't like him very much. He said that the vintage was noticeably cold when he arrived. You know, he hadn't worked for a trade union. He didn't have a manual labour job. He had a university degree. He had 2 university degrees. That was extremely rare in the Labor caucus. He's a barrister. That's not that unusual, but it's still not a common occupation. And he's 6'4". He's a bit aloof. He's a bit arrogant. He comes there with a lot of views. And he started to put people offside. And you know what? He didn't care. He just kept steamrolling them with his views on all sorts of issues. And so it was really interesting. You know, I got access to the Labor Party's caucus minutes. And all through the 1950s, you know, he's putting his hand up for some little delegation going somewhere or some committee being formed or, a meeting being organised with someone coming into town. And he's losing all these ballots, ballot after ballot after ballot. And he certainly can't get on the front bench, you know, where they used to have like an executive, not really like a shadow ministry, but an executive. He can't get anywhere. So it's really interesting. He's very unlike the traditional Labor MPs coming into the Parliament, and he's actually one of the first World War II veterans. There's a lot of World War I veterans, even Boer War veterans in the caucus when he arrives.
Yeah, and it's a struggle to eventually gets the leadership in 1967, but not without some significant opposition from all corners of the party for the reasons that you've outlined. He takes the leadership and, you know, it's a rocky road. He's, you know, at one point nearly loses the opposition leadership. He performs exceptionally well at the 1969 election. People often forget that 69 was a much better result for Labor than 72, even though Labor obviously forms government in 72. But he's bashing heads with, in particular, the Victorian left and the Bill Hartleyites of the world and the other old school Laborites. To talk us through that period. And, you know, eventually becomes famous for adopting the slogan, party, policy, people. Yeah.
Look, it is a rocky road. You know, he is a great admirer and supporter of Doc Evatt through the 1950s. And he becomes deputy leader in 1960 to Arthur Calwell. And probably up until about 1963, him and Calwell get on pretty well. You know, Calwell is born in the 19th century, very much an older style Labor figure, being a minister in the Curtin government, as you both know, and they get on pretty well. But then they start to divide pretty sharply after the 1963 election, and this is a period of turmoil, you know. And so by 1966, Gough nearly gets expelled from the Labor Party by the federal executive because he was not happy with the decision to revisit the party's position on state aid. So this is a really big issue. And state aid back then, of course, is the idea that governments can fund all schools, including non-government schools, like particularly Catholic schools. And Gough saw this as not a matter of just supporting Catholics, as some people did, but about equality of opportunity, about giving all students access to a good education. So that happens, and then he challenges Arthur Calwell for the leadership in 1966. He can't wait to get the job. And then when he does get the job, he finds himself challenged by Jim Cairns in 1968. And, you know, what's happening is he's really trying to get the Labor Party in a position where it can win government. So he's recruiting new candidates. He's changing the policies. He's reforming the party structures. And this brings up a lot of opposition to him. And so one of his kind of unsung achievements is that I actually think he probably saved the Labor Party. I mean, the Labor Party was really out of favour. You know, it was unrepresentative. It was undemocratic. Its policies were archaic. And so he kind of grabs the party by the neck. And this is difficult. He does it at party conference after party conferences, state branches, the national executive, the federal conference. But he does it. He gets the party sort of ready for government. And, of course, by 1972, the party's also rejuvenated its campaigning as well. And, you know, he has the appointment of Mick Young to run Labor's campaign. But, you know, something you guys might find interesting is that, can you believe it, that before 1969, the Labor Party would have a set amount of money for campaigns and they'd allocate that to each electorate equally, right? Which is just a crazy idea, right? I mean, now, of course,
they'd always done it. You know,
they'd always done it, and it seemed to be the fair thing. If you're in a safe seat, you should get as much money as the guy in a marginal seat or woman. not many women though. And so it's sort of crazy. And so he has to change all these things, and fund seats where they thought they could actually win them. I mean, it sounds crazy now, but this was really revolutionary at the time.
It was. I mean, that role of the participants that Gough worked with here in Melbourne, people like John Button, the late Race Matthews, who we lost recently, they really did undertake that essential, unappreciated perhaps at the time by many of the members, but that really hard work to not just make Labor electorally viable, but to drag them into the modern era of campaigning and communicating with people. And did your research for this find that was something Gough led nationally, or was he sort of dragged to that by others?
I think he's very much at the vanguard of it. He understood what it had to change within the party. But as you say, there are people like the participants who were supporting him, and the New South Wales Labor Party was always very much in Whitlam's camp, and the Tasmanians too. So Lance Barnard, who becomes his deputy, the Tasmanians were always really supportive. It's Victoria and Western Australia, and to some extent Queensland, which proved quite recalcitrant in reforming the Labor Party. And, of course, he gives that very famous speech, the impotent pure, in Victoria in 1967. And, yeah, I mean, that's what he had to do to change the party. And he did have supporters, but he was leading it. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's also interesting to reflect, Caldwell was very embittered by the experience. Of course, Caldwell wasn't particularly well behaved during World War II in the Curtin government. He and Eddie Ward drove John Curtin mental around the bend. And you're right, and Emma's right. It's certainly Whitlam's not. He's really important as an individual, but there are bigger currents of thoughts and ideas which are happening in the UK with Anthony Crosland, and here with the participants and the Fabians, and rethinking old school socialism and labourism around, a modern social democracy, focusing much more on equality of opportunity, and rethinking, the role of government, rethinking what a Labor government should do. It's not just all about, wages and working conditions, but, expanding the remit to the environment, the arts, issues of concern to middle-class professionals. Middle-class Australia is growing. Women are entering the workforce. But also, we can't sit there and list every single achievement of the great man, but there's one sort of meat potatoes reform, piece of sort of suburban reform that they get up to, which is, bringing sewerage to a lot of suburban Australia for the first time. Mm-hmm. People often forget about that kind of really basic material reform.
Yep.
Look, it's actually really interesting, the sewerage thing, which was providing money to local utilities or state governments to connect homes to the sewer, it changed people's lives. Like, in the middle of the night, you'd have to maybe walk out into the backyard and navigate the darkness and the spiders and the snakes, and then go to the loo and then come back inside. It'd be freezing cold in some places, of course. So, this is sort of a revolutionary reform. And what I found is that when Gough is in Cronulla, when he first gets elected, he's experiencing what many people are experiencing in the outer suburbs. So, yes, there'd been this period of post-war prosperity. A lot of those initiatives were put in place by the Curtin Chifley government, but the Menzies government was a largely stable and prosperous time for many people, and they expanded out to the outer suburbs. But, of course, the facilities didn't keep up. So even when Gough's living in Cronulla, there's no local high school, there's no general hospital, there's no sewerage connection, there's no local swimming pool, there's very few sporting fields. And so this is the agenda that he thinks, well, I'm living it in the outer suburbs. And then when he goes to Cabramatta in 1957, those inequalities are even greater between the outer suburbs and the inner suburbs. And sewerage is a really big part of that. So, yeah, he's really interested in urban planning, and I think some of these ideas came from him growing up in Canberra about seeing what a national government could actually do, play that big role in urban planning.
Yeah, like I said earlier, Troy, we could reel off achievement after achievement. I think it was Stephen Luce. I'm not sure whether Stephen Luce borrowed this line, but he wrote something for my edited collection, the Right Stuff, and he talked about Gough dragging Australia into the 1960s. It's a lovely turn of phrase. We are going to talk about some of the more dramatic aspects. It was a time of great reform, which everyone can read about in Troy's book, but also a certain amount of chaos. You say Gough's and his government's achievements are significant and lasting, but, quote, the mistakes and blunders are monumental. Can I ask you a question? Do you think there was a single decision which doomed the government, and what would it be?
Well, it's probably the loans affair, because the loans affair, when Rex Connor was found to be misleading Parliament over loan negotiations, that led the opposition to block supply in the Senate, and the blocking of supply in the Senate led to John Kerr's dismissal by surprise, without warning, and by ambush 50 years ago. So that's kind of it. And, we'll talk about the loans affair a bit, because this really is a monumental kind of breakdown in public policy processes. So the government had this idea that they could loan large amounts of money from the Middle East to invest in minerals and energies projects. So, railway electrification, port upgrades, new uranium mines, all sorts of things like that. And this was Rex Connor's dream, nicknamed the Strangler. And so few people wanted to challenge Rex in the caucus. And, after the 1974 election, he got the most votes. This is at a time when they used to elect the ministry with an open ballot. That hasn't happened for decades. So Rex was persistent with this. And through a roundabout set of ways, I came to interview a lot of the public servants and a lot of people who were involved in this. And he came across the idea of this guy called Tirath Kemlani, who was a Pakistani commodities trader. He wore safari suits, gold bangles, green sunglasses, just the sort of guy you want to borrow US $4 billion from. So they decided they'd use this guy. He said he can do it. He can get the money, but he didn't tell them who was going to lend the money, which bank would receive the money, or when exactly it would come. So they decided to authorise him anyway, but they didn't tell the cabinet, the caucus, the loan council, the states. They did it through an executive council meeting. And this is not the best way to go. And, of course, the senior public servants, Treasury, Attorney General's Department, are saying this guy's a con man. They're saying it explicitly and openly in memos. But they went ahead anyway. And, of course, the money never arrived. And they kept reauthorising him. And Connor kept this dream going. And the money never came. And then he was found to have misled Parliament about continuing the negotiations after his authority was revoked. So this is a really big failure. And it gets to the style of the government. The style of government is really important. Processes are important. And Whitlam didn't really listen to advice. He was a lone ranger. He was followed his own star. He was a bit gullible sometimes, a bit naive, and this is it writ large with the loans affair. So it's a tragedy. I mean, it would have been great, I guess, if they got these kind of loan monies and did transform our minerals and energy sector. It'd be kind of like we'd be kind of like one of those northern European countries with a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund or something like that. But it didn't happen, of course. They were conned, and they were being told they were being conned at the time. And so to talk to some of these public servants that were involved has been just eye-popping, the stories about it, and they just didn't want to believe it. And so there's a lesson here about how to run a government. And I think, subsequent prime ministers, particularly Anthony Albanese, says he's learnt that lesson.
That's interesting to me. I think if you look at the history of Labor PMs, they can fall into one of two camps. Gough, famously resistant to taking advice. Some might argue Kevin Rudd was similar. And yet then you have very consultative and engaging prime ministers like Curtin, Chifley, Hawke, who run, good cabinet processes. You've spoken to Albanese about this. Do you think he has? I mean, he's notorious for he's one of the best parliamentary tacticians the country's ever seen, right? He knows what he's doing. Do you think he genuinely has learnt that lesson about consultative government, about cabinet government, about taking advice?
Look, I do, Emma. I think that, we can look back at the last 3.5 years or so and, there hasn't really been any scandals. Party's been pretty united. All the cabinet ministers say, yeah, of course, they might have some disagreements and some debates. That's good. But there's a proper cabinet process to be followed. the public service is consulted and asked to give their advice on different things. The government is staging their policy reforms. They put a premium on communication and explanation. There's an orderly sense to the government, and that is a lesson I think he has learned. And he launched the book a few weeks ago, and he was obviously reading it in the months leading up to that, and he was sending me text messages or ringing me up saying, I'm finding this really interesting. This is the first prime ministerial biography he's read as prime minister. Mm-hmm. And so he's thinking about the decisions that Whitlam is making and thinking, would I do it the same way? Would I do something differently? How would I react in this situation? So it's had, I think, an impact on him, and it's made him think about it. So that's kind of the key lesson I think he has taken on board. But I think there's another lesson here, and that is he's probably got to be a little bit more bolder, a little bit more courageous, take a few more policy risks. So he doesn't have to be sort of crazy brave like Gough, but, a bigger agenda probably would be welcomed, I think, by the party and I think by many voters.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's circle back to that theme of Whitlam's afterlife and Albo's Labor, but let's just pause. I'm going to hit the pause button now, Troy, because it's my show. The events of 50 years ago today, 11th of November 1975, again, I think it's worth pointing out that for this is ancient history for a lot of Australians, new and old, or recently arrived. If you had, if in 120 seconds, Troy, can you tell our listeners what was at play? Why was the government dismissed? I'll give you a little bit longer if you like.
Right, I've got my watch here. I'm going to time it. So look, the opposition decided to block the budget in the Senate. That meant they wouldn't pass the budget. They would just simply keep deferring it, and they did that on the 16th of October, 1975, and this was, I think, the whole thing that then ended in the dismissal of the Whitlam government by the Governor-General by surprise by using these so-called reserve powers. I think it is a train wreck for our democracy. So, a budget had never been blocked before in the Senate. The coalition was able to do that because Conservative state premiers had not replaced departing Labor senators with senators from the same party. So they're able to manipulate the numbers and rely on a tainted Senate. So they're smashing precedents, they're breaking conventions. And Malcolm Fraser, the opposition leader, he makes it quite clear. He's pushing the political system to the brink. He wants to destroy the Whitlam government. He wants to force it to a general election. And then he says that the Governor-General should intervene to dismiss the Prime Minister. Now, I was astonished to find that he had said that publicly in September 1975, a month before the budget is even blocked. And so what happens on November 1975 is Whitlam, who can't get his budget through, settles on the idea of a half-Senate election. And he goes to Government House to recommend that. And the Governor-General says that's not going to get supply through. And you know what? He's right about that. I don't think Gough ever really had a viable solution to this crisis. He didn't know how to get supply, which is his budget. And he's recommending a course of action, a half-Senate election, which wasn't going to result in any more Labor senators. So the Governor-General dismissed him. Now, he did so without warning, using these ancient powers. And I think the consensus now is that was the wrong thing to do. And so that's what happened in 1975. And then, of course, he remitted the decision to the Australian people with an election. And that election was granted, and we held that election, and the Whitlam government then didn't return to power. But there's a lot of messy things happen here. Malcolm Fraser was the Prime Minister, and he had a motion of no confidence passed in him that afternoon. The High Court was implicated because Garfield Barwick, the Chief Justice, and Anthony Mason had given advice to John Kerr. So we're seeing a lot of our conventions and protocols and precedents break down. And this was not a satisfactory outcome to a supply crisis.
Had he taken the PMC advice about the supply bills going back to the House? Is the dismissal avoided?
Well, I think what he should have done is warned Whitlam. I think, there's this protocol developed by Walter Bagehot, an English writer, that the Crown has the right to consult and to warn and to advise. So that's what should have happened here. John Kerr should have levelled with his Prime Minister and said, I don't think your course of action is sound here. if you can't get supply through, there's going to have to be an election. That is a constitutional principle. But he decided not to do that. He decided to hide his true feelings and operate, as he said in his notes, by stealth. So it's a craven and cowardly act. And he did that because he feared that if he told Whitlam what he was thinking, he'd be dismissed himself. So he's acting out of cowardice, but it's the wrong solution. It was a dramatic and convulsive intervention using these crown powers. And that was a mistake. And this is something that the Queen would never have done herself, and never supported this action being taken. You know, in all the correspondence that was written between Kerr and Buckingham Palace, they say things like, you know, we would always follow the Prime Minister's advice in any matters. They say this is a political crisis, not a constitutional one. They say you have reserve powers, but only use them as a last resort when there's no other alternative. And, of course, there was an alternative, which was to talk to Whitlam about the problem and come up with another solution. So it is, as I say, a train wreck for our institutions. But, you know, I interviewed the Governor-General the other day, and she highlighted that our system has been resilient, that we have recovered. But she also said she wouldn't have done what Kerr did. And that's been a consistent view from all the Governors-General since 1975 onwards.
I love what you interviewed Paul Keating for the book. I love what Keating had to say. He said to you, you know, never holds back, PJK. He said, I would have arrested him. I would have said, you're abusing a kingly power that was never yours to abuse. How realistic was that?
Well, look, it sounds crazy. It sounds like a bit of a, you know, brain snap from Paul Keating there, but he's deadly serious. He said this is what he would have done. And you can actually see a scenario in the afternoon of November 11 where this might have actually worked. So let's just talk about this briefly. So if Whitlam's Prime Minister, he says, look, I'm not going to accept your advice. You don't have these powers. I have the majority in the House of Representatives. That's where the government is made. I have that confidence. And you're under house arrest. And then he would have told the Senate. So what happened was that Whitlam didn't tell the senators that they had been dismissed. And so they voted for supply. And by voting for supply, they reinforced Malcolm Fraser in office. So what Keating is saying is if supply continued to be delayed, not granted to Fraser, then he could have contacted the palace and said, well, you've got a rogue Governor-General here. I've got the confidence of the House of Representatives. And neither the opposition leader nor myself have supply. So I need to be reinstated. And you can kind of see a scenario where the palace, who had always said we would follow the Prime Minister's advice, might have gone with the person who had the confidence of the House. Now, this would have been a very even more dramatic and convulsive moment. But there's kind of a method there, I think. It's not entirely madness.
Of course, Gough was off having a steak at the lodge. I wonder if it was I fillet or a Scotch medium rare. All jokes aside, reflecting on your comments there, do we need to sort of drop the, quote, maintain the rage lens and come to see Whitlam? I know Paul Kelly, I think, drove home this point as well over the weekend. Really wonderful piece by the Prof, as more of a constitutionalist than any kind of sort of proto-populist.
Well, Gough also said at the end of that speech, maintain your enthusiasm for democracy. So, yes, I think there is a recognition now that the court wouldn't secretly consult with the Governor-General about a possible dismissal. And I don't think the opposition would block supply, although we can't be 100% sure about that given the way our politics is going. And I don't think, as I've just said, a Governor-General wouldn't deceive their Prime Minister with a surprise dismissal. So what's happened in the last 50 years is our institutions have kind of recovered and learnt lessons. The lesson is we can't do this again. But Whitlam, what he really wanted was there to be a republic. Now, he died more than 10 years ago. I think he'd be surprised that we're still not a republic if he was around now. And so a lot of the Labor Party's energies from the late 1970s on was, you know, becoming a republic. And it's now just completely off the agenda. It is a distant possibility at best. But that was seen as the solution here, that these kingly powers, as Keating called them, were not appropriate in the 20th or 21st century. And a republic, which clearly spelled out roles and obligations and powers in a constitution was the way to go. So that was kind of the big hope, I think, after 1975 when he talked about rage and enthusiasm, but it hasn't happened.
And he, of course, joins the unity tick with Malcolm Fraser on that very
He did. He did. Well, in that 99 referendum, Malcolm Fraser joined with Gough Whitlam, and in one of the commercials, Fraser turned to Whitlam and said, "Gough, it's time."
I remember that.
Well, that's more than, what's that, 25 years ago? So,
Yep.
Yeah. So, it's a long time ago. And we still haven't, the Republic movement hasn't really unified on the best model or process.
26 years ago is a long time. 50 years ago is a very long time ago. And, you make the point that Whitlam was the first PM actually to be seen on full colour TV. I mean, got the famous It's Time 1972 election adverts. So a couple of questions for you. How much of this legend is simply that Gough, looked better than the drab political culture around him and the sort of the moribund Liberal Party, which has kind of run out of steam by 72? And also, I know that, you have been mining the archives, particularly for photos. Is there a single image, I know you're very proud of this, Troy, there's a single image which you think tells the story of Gough in 1975 the best?
Well, there's a good image on the back of the book, which is Gough on a deck chair by the pool in Surfers Paradise. So one of the things about his character was that he loved to recline and he loved to get his shoes off. So that's what he liked to do. And he still looks commanding and imposing. He's there in a suit and tie by the pool, as you would, of course. So he's a commanding and impressive figure. He stands out. He's got a vision. He's bold. He's courageous. But he's on his own. He's a loner. He's not very good at managing a cabinet, managing a party, working with the public service. He's not very collegiate. And so this is the kind of defining flaw that I think I found about him, that he didn't really work well with others. He was naive about human nature. He was sometimes over-trusting. He had a difficulty being in collegiate relationships, which is not great if you're running a government or running a party. And so some of those flaws became very evident by the end of the government, and particularly the dismissal. He thought he understood John Kerr better than anybody else, and he fatally misread him. So the image of Gough, the loner, but still imposing and dominating and in colour and vivid and exciting, is kind of the paradox. So what I say is the big puzzle is a government with a towering legacy of achievements, but one that was also so dysfunctional, chaotic, scandalised, poor budget management, poor economic management. And yet all that happened, yet the achievements remain. I mean, there hasn't been a government like this. I mean, it's a really strange puzzle. And the answer, of course, is really Gough. Gough is the one who is the best and worst thing about the government. He's the one who pushes ahead like a steamroller to get all these things happening, but his blind spots end up being fatal. And, over the years, guys, when I've interviewed the ministers in the Whitlam government, people like Doug McClellan, Paul Keating and Moss Cass and Bill Hayden and all these guys, they're proud of the government, but they were very critical of Gough in the final years of their lives. They thought, he could have run the show better, and they might have been in government longer if they had that leadership. So there's an important lessons there, I think, for all governments.
There are, Troy, and I think what's fascinating to me about that and looking at the party today is the truth. I mean, it remains the fact that the largest group of ALP members in the country are still those that joined in the Whitlam years, right?
Yes.
And they hold on to the memory of Gough as a crusader, as a reformer, and they see him as the zenith of our past leadership. The contrast with the attitude of many true believers today who seem to be very frustrated with the modern Labor government that they're not bold enough, they're not visionary enough, they're not, making those big calls, making those big changes. But the thing they are doing very well that Gough didn't is the actual management of governance, the cabinet system. They're not succumbing to hubris despite having, the largest majority since Curtin in the Second World War. And I think, what's interesting is that the political class, the media class, the non-partisan approach to government will say that is what's important. What's important is how well you manage your party, how well you manage processes and institutions. But so many of the Labor Party membership and the true believers, they want the opposite. They seem to want the big picture thinking, the oratory of Gough and Paul Keating. And no matter what achievements the current government's made, particularly in economic management, in industrial relations reform, in lifting wages for working families, getting inflation down, doesn't seem to cut through in the way that Gough was able to do. How do we manage that tension? How does a leader today like Albanese ensure that he does maintain the enthusiasm of the true believers without succumbing to that more perhaps hubristic or high-minded style that can be quite destructive to the process of governance?
Emma, look, it is really interesting, for a whole generation of Labor supporters, Labor Party members, for them, Gough did carry the light towards a new Australia. And he is the one who is in their beating hearts to this day. Nobody surpasses him. They are kind of blind to his faults and his mistakes and his misjudgments. There's a great story that Labor Party members in 1975 became experts on sport because they only read the back pages of the newspapers, not the front pages. So I think the lesson is the Hawke-Keating government, right? I mean, the Hawke-Keating government. This will get Nick rolled up, but the Hawke-Keating government learnt they learnt the lessons, right? Bill Hayden, Bob Hawke, and Paul Keating learnt the lessons. And Hawke used to say his ultimate aim was to be a long-term Labor government. Now Anthony Albanese says that too now.
Yep.
But they kind of learnt those lessons. So you can be bold, you can leave a big legacy, but you've got to get the management of government right. It's really important, and a lot of that starts at the top. So I think that's kind of the sweet spot. And, when the new government, the Albanese government, came into power, none of them were saying we want to be like Whitlam. None of them were saying that. They were all saying we want to be like Hawke and Keating. That's what they were saying, and they still say it. So that's kind of the touchstone, I think, for modern Labor politicians. But the true believers, they're still with Gough.
I think I couldn't agree with that analysis more. What's interesting to me is that 50 years on, we now have another generation of young people that are actually getting pretty desperate for some bold policy reform, for some real reform of the economy and of social policy. And the current Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, makes it clear that he sees these things going in kind of 40 to 50-year cycles. When Keating was transforming Australia, it was 50 years since the Curtin Chifley years. Now it's 50 years since Gough. And of course, there are members of the Greens who have claimed that they're the real inheritors of Gough's legacy. How does Labor? For a start, what do you think Gough would think of that, given he's only the impotent, a pure comment? But how does Labor grapple with that desire, not just the nostalgia of the older true believers, but this coming wave of younger, more progressive people that are kind of fed up with the incrementalist approach?
Look, it's a big challenge. I wish I had all the answers. But the Labor Party's an old party. It's 125, 135 years old, something like that.
134 years old. Right?
134.
135 next year.
Okay, so it's an old party, right? And it seems for a lot of young people, they see it as part of the establishment, right?
Yep.
And so, what Gough was able to do and what I think Hawke and Keating were able to do, particularly Keating, I think, was animate a new agenda, come up with the issues that are going to excite people to join your cause. And, I remember as a university student in the mid-1990s, the Keating agenda for a lot of people was very exciting, going into Asia, which was still seen as a big sort of bold new idea, a republic, Indigenous reconciliation and land rights. These were big cultural touchstones for a lot of people, and they made people join the Labor Party and vote Labor and support him. And there's a whole lot of other people who they're the issues that why they didn't want to vote Labor. But you've got to come up with the issues. And what I think about the Labor Party's constituency at the moment is I'm not sure there's anything that's really exciting young people. What are they really going to be excited about? And that's what Gough did. He made politics exciting for people. And it's not just about great speeches and great interviews and parliamentary cut and thrust. It's about the policies. And he was able to do that. So that's what Labor's got to do, is come up with the ideas. Ideas.
Troy, thank you. Well, may we say God save the King these days. I don't mean that as a Republican. As a trio, we're all Republicans unless there's something unless you've had a sort of conversion on the way to 50.
Never.
Troy, good.
Never. I am Republican, lowercase r, through and through.
May we say God save the King, but nothing will save the pod from running out of time. But please buy Troy's book, Gough Whitlam, The Vista of the New, which is out through HarperCollins. You won't miss it. It's in every single bookshop. You can buy it online, go into the store. Troy, it's been an absolute pleasure. Congratulations on this monumental achievement. What's next, actually, before we finish?
Look, I haven't decided. I'm interested in political power and leadership, so I'm going to continue with the prime ministers. I think I've got, 27 to go. So I've got to find another good one. Another one that's really going to sustain my interest.
You better get your skates on if you've got 27 to go and you're about to turn 50, mate. I mean, I know you're prolific, but...
I can't be underestimated. Don't worry about that. Anyway, it's great to talk to you, Nick and Emma. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Best of luck with that endeavour, Troy. Thank you so much for making time on this busy schedule in and around the 50th anniversary of the Dismissal. Emma Dawson, thank you, and I'll catch you next week, and I'll catch you, Curtinistas, men and women of Australia, next week on Curtin's Cast. It's ciao and arrivederci.